Okay, we are a small group this evening, but we are recording this so that it will be a resource for the future and for those who've registered but are not able to be here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm David Locke. I'm a past master of the company and past chairman of the education committee. And it's my pleasure to moderate our webinar this evening. As you will know, service with integrity is the motto of our company. And it's easy to say, and we think we know what we mean by it, but do we? What does it mean in 2024? When I was master of the company in 2017-18, I invited speakers for our functions from academia, from the church, and from the senior ranks of the civil service. And I asked each of the speakers to address the question of what they understood by integrity. And we had some great stories from them, most of which I can still remember. But let me say, they clearly found the topic challenging. Now, we have in recent years expanded our education work, and Leeds Beckett University joined us 3 or 4 years ago. And also when we were looking to establish our research work, it was Leeds Beckett University that offered the most relevant portfolio for us to work with. That research is on the values, or the importance of values in governance. In January of this year, I had the pleasure to participate in a research seminar in Leeds Beckett University. And one of the people presenting was Dr. Karen Volum-Dix. And she was presenting on her slides were headed, "The Elusive Meaning of Values." And the value that she was looking at was the value of integrity. Now, linking all of this, I thought it would be a good idea to ask if Karen would join us for an evening and would present to us. And I'm delighted that she has said yes. Now, Karen is a senior lecturer at Leeds Beckett University, Leeds Business School. She grew up in Southern Africa. She has a degree in mechanical engineering, and that was where she worked for 10 years or so. She's passionate about working towards a more inclusive society. And tonight, Karen, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And we've invited you to speak for about 30 minutes on service with integrity. What does it mean to you? And then we will go into a discussion. And it's my wish that tonight will be mutually useful. Mutually useful to us because it will help us understand something about integrity, and mutually useful to Karen, who is undertaking research in this area. So Karen, over to you.
Thank you very much, and welcome everybody. So because we hope to continue research, and I will explain to you what research I've already done, because we hope to continue research on this topic, according to our university ethics process, in order to use any of the content from this evening, I need to have your consent. So the webinar was going to be recorded anyway. If you're happy for us to use content from the discussion, then the easiest way to do this is to assume your consent, unless you tell us that you would like your comments redacted from any transcript that we have of the discussion. When I do research, any comments that anybody made will be anonymised. We store everything confidentially, your organisation and that anonymised as well, so we can't trace back who said what. So I do hope that you are happy with us using transcript from this evening to add to further our understanding of integrity. So, say if we work on the basis that you're happy, unless you say otherwise, my email address is on the first slide, which will be shared. Just let David or I know through the chat or through email if you want us to redact your comments. So let's move on to the main event. What I'm presenting is essentially the sum of the findings from my doctoral research. So the research was a phenomenographic, it's a bit of a mouthful, study of values. And I studied values in general, but specifically studied 3, which were integrity, respect, and fairness. So what I've done tonight is extract the information on integrity. The reason that I chose integrity was because when I was deciding which were the best values in an organizational context to study, I looked at the codes of ethics of a number of professional bodies. I looked at company websites. I looked at the introductions to annual reports, and integrity was amongst the most commonly cited values. So, first of all, why should we care about values anyway? There's an increasing body of research and evidence which suggests that organizations which focus on values, I suppose, rather than focusing purely on profit or finance, for example, tend to be more successful, more sustainable in the long term. Organizations which focus on and live their values score higher in employee commitment and employee engagement, and that clearly has an impact in terms of attracting and retaining employees. And coincidentally, I've just been doing some reading about very, very recent research, which shows the number of people who have become disengaged in the period since COVID. So employee engagement and really taking note of what our employees want to keep them engaged and retain them in the business is a very, very current topic. It's not enough just to have values. We need to make sure that everything we do in the organisation is aligned with those values. And one way to tell that is, if a visitor comes into the organisation, can they tell what you're all about when they walk in? Or do they assume, well, I guess people will assume what you're all about. As they get to know you, will those assumptions prove to be right or not? So just a very brief bit on phenomenography, which is the research approach that I took. Generally speaking, when you do qualitative research, you analyse things looking for common themes in what people say. And that's fine. But I wanted to do this rather differently. I came across phenomenography, which I found fascinating. It is about studying the variation and the difference in people's perception of a common phenomenon. So I took the phenomenon to be values because we all have them, we all live with them. Our values drive our behaviours. So they are a common phenomenon to everybody. In phenomenography, unlike some research, we're not testing hypotheses, we're not building theory, we're not trying to generalize and say, because I've found this certain thing in a small sample group, it's going to be true for everybody else. Instead, we're taking a relatively small sample. Mine was 19 people. And we're looking for the variation in what they say about the phenomenon so that we can gain a deeper understanding of it. So the research is about developing understanding. But it's also important that we don't, as a researcher, impose, and it's almost impossible not to do this at all, but we try really hard to not impose any of our prior knowledge into the analysis. So it's a very rigorous analytical process. And we don't do our reading about the topic until after we've done the research. So we kind of limit our own understanding whilst we do the research itself. So my sample, as I say, was 19 people, had an age range from 18 to 80. I had mixed gender and mixed ethnicity. So it's not meant to be a representative sample, but I did have a good heterogeneous sample, and you need that heterogeneous sample in order to find variation. Enough of that, let's get to the interesting bit, which is integrity. Lots of organisations, including yours, value integrity. And we talk about integrity kind of just as integrity, based on an assumption that everybody knows what it is. We don't tend to discuss very much what it is. We just know. So I wanted to find out whether it really is just something that everybody knows, or whether there is variation. So what I'd really appreciate now, if you feel comfortable doing that, is just type into the chat what you think integrity is. Now, I'm going to give you some of the findings from my research when I move on to the next slide. So I hope that doesn't influence the words that you type in too much, but I'd really appreciate your views. What do you think integrity is? How would you define it? So this is what my interview participants said. There were some themes appearing, but there was no single definition. This is just a snapshot of some of the things that people said. It's by no means everything. But integrity, it's about doing the right thing. It's about having moral standards. It's about being trustworthy and acting with consistency. It's about acting with honesty. So there's some common themes there, but we've got quite a difference in what people actually said. Having asked people to define integrity, I then asked them about how they perceive integrity in other people. And the answers to that were really interesting. So some people define integrity in terms of how they personally behave. So integrity is when I behave in this particular way, when I do things like this. But there were other people who defined it in terms of other people. So integrity is when you act in a particular way, or integrity is when other people do things like this. So it's also interesting because people gave lots of examples that helped them to define what it is, which I guess David said previous people that he's spoken to gave stories. I found people told me stories too. It's difficult to define, but you can give examples of it. So whilst I was thinking about this afternoon, I thought, you know, it's one of those words, integrity, one of those words which is difficult to define. And a similar sort of situation came to mind, which is if I said to you, describe the colour green to me, that's really hard. Most people, when you ask them to describe a colour, will say, well, green, that's the colour of leaves on a tree. Green, that's the colour of grass. But, you know, if you're blind or colourblind, if you've never seen a tree and you've never seen grass, if you live in the desert, how do you know? You're no clearer what green means because you're only describing it in relation to something else. And I found that integrity was very like that. So some of the quotes on the next slide are what people said about integrity in others. And I guess one other thing that became very clear was that whilst we can be quite clear in our own mind when we observe somebody else's behaviour, we can be quite clear in our own mind whether that person has integrity or not. The only definition of integrity that we're really sure about is our own. So we make judgments about whether other people have integrity, but actually we only know our own definition unless we go and talk to people. So, as I say, some people measure the integrity of others against whether you meet my definition of integrity. You have integrity if you meet my standards and you do what I feel is morally right. Other people look for consistency in the behaviour of others and make a judgment on whether somebody has integrity based on whether that other person acts consistently in accordance with what we perceive that person's values to be. So, as an example, had anyone noticed we're in the middle of a general election campaign? People make judgments about politicians. So, one example, I don't agree with that particular politician. I'm going to mention no names here, but that politician is consistent in everything they say and do. That politician has a very clear and consistent message, and I admire the integrity that they have because you know where they're coming from and you know that what they're, the kind of thing they're going to say, they're consistent, and I admire that. So that is measuring somebody's integrity based on their behaviour. Another way of looking at integrity, which we hear just as often, is, oh, I really can't listen to that clown. They go on and on about the same thing all the time. I totally disagree with them. Their methods are appalling. The way of them saying they're going to achieve something is impossible. They have no integrity. So we've got something very similar. They say the same thing over and over again. We kind of predict what they're going to say, but because what they say is something I don't like, I don't think they've got integrity. Now, you can decide which you think is the deepest, the best way to measure integrity. Is it all about whether or not people are like you, or should we be measuring people against their own standards? It is clear that people do both, and I'm not here to judge. So we have our own opinion as to what is right and wrong. We don't know other people's definitions unless we talk to them. But the other thing that we need to talk to people about, the other thing that became clear, is that there's an element of motivation in this as well. So that speech bubble at the bottom left of the slide there, there's no integrity in others if they're doing things for their own benefit. So that suggests that people judge the integrity in others, not merely by observing their behaviours, but also by making assumptions about the motivations behind those behaviours. And I think sometimes those assumptions can be stronger and prevent people sort of listening in terms of dialogue. Also, what became clear is that, looking at this top speech bubble here on the right, if integrity, and the same was said about trust, is lost, in fact, the same was said about respect, if it's lost, it's very hard to regain it. People will tend to remember those negative incidents that breach trust, respect, integrity more than they remember all the consistent behaviours that that reflect that it's there. Moving into an organisational context, and most of the conversations I had with people were about their values per se, but we did talk about organisational examples as well. So words like honesty, transparency, keeping to your word. Actually, a lot of this we can hear being said in the election campaigning. Keeping to your word, don't make promises that you can't keep. Be respectful. Were all mentioned in this context. One participant noted that they'd worked in a number of different organisations, and we know that many organisations value integrity, but they had never heard anybody have a discussion about integrity in a business context. That's quite scary, isn't it? We value it. We assume about it. We make assumptions about it. But do we necessarily talk about it? We also looked at integrity in different cultures. And what became clear here is that, and I don't have long enough to go into as much depth as I would like to, apologies for that, but there is a greater potential or potential for greater misunderstanding and difference in understanding about integrity the more diverse and multicultural an organisation is, because culture and religion both impact on people's beliefs about what is right and wrong. And again, some people will measure others by their own beliefs and values, and other people will want to learn about somebody else's or observe people's consistency. So we've got a mix of the way that people understand and interpret integrity, but we've also got quite a number of different factors that will influence the way that people see it. This is complex. Integrity is not simple. So, analysing the results, one of the things that we look for in phenomenography is the relationship between the things that we identify. So looking at the relationship between values and words, the words that people described integrity with, it suggested to me that integrity is a core value. It's all about moral standards. It's deep. We identify it in others by looking at, there was a cluster of words around being true to your word and your values. So that was about authenticity and trust and respect. And then there was another level, which was what we observe, which is consistency. And that was defined also in terms of fairness and honesty. So, and those are the things that we judge ourselves and other people by in the context of integrity. So moving on then to the literature, just a snippet of that. This particular table here was one researcher, Robinson, who looked at the work of 6 others who are in that left-hand column in the table. I've highlighted in the table the words and the concepts that appeared in my sample of conversations. So there are similarities in what I found with my sample and in what these researchers have found in their theory. And what I would suggest is one of the most powerful similarities that I can see is that no one researcher and no one interviewee had anything like a definition that summed up all the complexity. The only way that we can understand integrity is by talking to lots of people and reading as much as we can. It is by looking at those different understandings and attempts to academically define it that actually develop the deepest understanding of it. So the implications that come from that, I'm trying not to repeat anything I've already said, but what became clear from both the research and the reading was that we have a much better understanding of our own definition of integrity if we have self-awareness. And I do work on self-awareness with students a lot of the time, and believe me, you cannot take for granted that people have self-awareness. It's something that we constantly need to be working on. One way of developing self-awareness is through critical reflection. And for me, a lot of that is about questioning and challenging, critiquing what we do, what our understanding is, why we do particular things. So in the same way as we need to have dialogue with others, which in that dialogue is respectful and contains critique and feedback, we also need to do the same with ourselves. Integrity requires us to have a dynamic balance between our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviours. So being consistent in all of those aspects within our personal moral boundaries. And that consistency is not always easy. You know, just reflect on, are there any times when you've thought one thing and then said something else and behaved in accordance with what you said with somebody else, but there's not a complete alignment? I think it's those moments when we don't have alignment, when we sense that we've either said something that we don't completely agree with, or we thought something that's not in alignment with what we're saying, that actually the greatest learning comes. But we need to reflect in order to be able to do that. So that consistently thinking and feeling is very internal, but intent and motives are, both from the reading and from what people said to me, intent and motives, which are very internal, are an important part of integrity. And I guess that is quite similar to some of the work on ethics. You know, if you're acting ethically, there are different theorists that would say it's all about your behaviour and what you do. And there are others that say the whole process starts much further back than that. And it's in the intent and the thinking that happens before your actions. So we've got a very similar parallel, I think, there between ethics and integrity. One of the authors that I came across when I was reading was Mary Gentile. And this table here is based on the results of my research and also on what Gentile said. So just briefly, if I can, if we look at the left-hand side of the table here, we've got integrity, respect, fairness, and love, which are the deepest core values. They are absolutely associated with people's moral code and their perception of what is right and wrong. And they are the most stable. So when I ask people how their values had developed during their life experience, they echoed that stability. You know, some people's idea of what's right and wrong had changed, but actually for a lot of people, that doesn't change much throughout your life. It's a pretty stable value. And you'll see here, it also says end values. These core values are end values, as opposed to means values. So there's that common saying, a means to an end. So we can interpret that by saying, you know, our means values are ways in which we act, behave, think in order to get alignment with those end values. As we go from left to right across that continuum, we move through values which are, I want to say, increasingly less moral content. Can I say increasingly less? Decreasing in moral content. So the values on the right, which actually you'll recognize as being values that a lot of organizations have in their mission statements, their value statements on their websites. These are surface level. These are, that doesn't mean they're superficial. They can be really important in organizations, but they have the least moral content. They are also the least stable, because we can change our understanding and our opinion about what they mean and how we, you know, let's just take money. The amount of money that is important to you when you're a student is probably very, very different from the amount of money that you feel you need to live when you've got a family and a mortgage. So we change our understanding and our meaning of these much more frequently than we do those on the left. And I guess if I just move on to the next slide and go right down to this second bullet point from the end, values such as these on the right here are ones where we can and often want to accept more plurality and understanding in an organization. So if we want, what do I mean by that? If in an organization we want everybody to act with integrity, we want to have a common understanding of what we mean by integrity. Now, we know that's going to be challenging to achieve, but we want everybody to act in a similar way because that's part of our culture and our organizational brand. We probably want a different attitude to creativity from our new product, new service development team than we want from our accountants. So a bit of plurality and situational understanding of what we mean by these terms is perfectly acceptable. So again, that plurality or focus is potentially associated with the level of moral content in the values. So some of the other findings here, rather than quote any of those, I'm going to move on to the next slide because this looks at the implications of those findings in an organizational context. It is important to clearly articulate your core values and what you mean by them. So it's not enough just to say we want you to act with integrity. We need to articulate what we mean by that. What are the behaviors that are acceptable? It's more difficult to start talking about people's motivations, but actually, I think we can probably go right back to our recruitment and try and understand people's values and motivations. Motivations, of course, change depending on circumstances, but we need to define our expectations. Once we articulate what we mean by values, then we need to give time within the organisation to discuss what we actually mean by that and ensure that we develop a common understanding and that people know what is expected of them. Actions speak louder than words, so it is particularly important that leaders and managers act as role models, using the organisational values as the basis for determining the way in which they make decisions and their behaviours. And, you know, other work I'm doing at the moment is to do with attitude to risk and how an organisation approaches risk and how that links with their decision making and their organisational values. So we've got to look for alignment in all these different organisational approaches. And if we get it right, then it will help to engage and retain the people we've got. But it also helps recruitment, because if you develop a reputation for being an organisation with integrity, a lot of people value that and would potentially be attracted. What was very clear from my research and from both the interviews and from a lot of the reading that I did is that our understanding and interpretation of values, so our values may not, our core values may not change, but our understanding, our examples, our awareness does change as we get older, but also with the experiences that we have, with the traveling that we do, with the new people that we meet. And actually, it is often difficult, challenging situations that make people think about their values. We don't always think about them until they're challenged, and that. So pretty important as organisations to make time and space and budget, I guess, for shared experiences, for travelling, for meeting new and diverse people. That experience and that learning is not enough unless we have conversation, critique, feedback, and we give people time to reflect. Also interesting that organisations must be adaptive over time. So that doesn't mean organisations need to change their values, but organisations that adapt and have a dynamic approach perform better than those that are rigidly stable over time. So what I would suggest that means is that, yes, absolutely, you can say integrity is always our core value. But as society changes in terms of, you know, the first thing that springs to mind for me here is attitudes to gender, for instance, have changed over, certainly during my lifetime. And so what it means to be integrity in a context, what it means to have integrity in a societal context may mean something slightly different now to what it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. Legislation changes, expectations change, different generations have different views about things. So it's not necessarily our values that need to change, but we need to be willing to have a dynamic approach to understanding how those values will be seen and interpreted in a wider context. Never assume that everybody understands words in the same way as you do. Many words have multiple meanings, and integrity is one of those words. So I know I've gone fast through some of that, but just as a final thought to leave you with, I guess we're all familiar with that term greenwashing. So I kind of use the word values washing. It's not enough just to say, as an organization, that you have integrity. It has to be lived and breathed and seen in everything that you do. If we're talking about values, those come from within. If all we do is act in a way that we think people expect us to, that's like building a foundation on sand. So clearly define and communicate the behaviors, the attitudes that are acceptable. Understand how that impacts decision-making and relationships with stakeholders throughout your organization. Be a role model. Don't just judge other people purely on your own understanding of things. Talk to people. Dialogue and reflection take time. So make sure that we give time for that and try and avoid that say-do gap. Doing what we say and both thinking and acting with integrity is really important. So I'm going to leave it there, but open it up now to questions. And within the following, the time that we've got, what attitude do you, I'm going to just ask you some questions, be cheeky here. What does service with integrity mean to you? How does it impact the way that you behave in an organization or a societal context? How does it impact the way that you make decisions? How does your view of integrity impact your expectation of others? Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you, Karen. Perhaps you could stop sharing so we can see each other slightly larger. And while people are thinking, can I just make 3 brief points? Firstly, your presentation has helped me to understand why the City of London slogan, "My word is my bond," is so powerful, because it's actually got so much in it that you have brought out from your research. Secondly, when I was setting up the British University in Dubai, one of the challenges I had was to build a university that had integrity. And I figured that one of the ways to do that was to ask people when I was interviewing them, excuse me, ask people when I was interviewing 3 questions. One was if they felt, or if they understood the concept of integrity and what did it mean to them. And of course, everybody did and gave different accounts, some of which lined up with what you've shared this evening. Secondly, I asked whether they considered themselves to be a person of integrity. And of course, the answer was always yes. And then I asked them a third question, which was really the most useful one. What was the source of their integrity? And some of them referred to their religion, some referred to their parents, some referred to their own experience. But that question told me a huge amount about the people. Now, the end of this story is that 10 years after leaving that role, I went back. And a person who I had appointed to the most junior administrative level as I was leaving said, "Have you got a minute?" And she had been promoted and now had her own office. And she said, "I wanted to share something with you." She said, "When I came for an interview," she said, "I hadn't a clue why you were asking me about integrity. 10 years later, I do." And I can see how this institution does work with integrity. And so by using it, then it certainly had value for that institution. My final thing is the power of what you shared with us by suggesting that we should share our experience and reflect. And maybe Keith, our clerk, that's something that we don't do in the company, and maybe we should. But those are just three things that struck me. Other things I'm sure struck other people, and you asked some jolly good questions. So let's open the floor for people's reactions or their questions.
Well, I'll happily start, David, if that's all right.
Please.
I mean, companies, as Karen said, quite often quote in their terms and everything else to say that they have integrity, or they are integrity, you know, whatever it is. But as we quite rightly learn there, integrity is something you yourself define from your own personal experiences. It's something that you learn over the years. It's something you see in other people. It's something that you somehow come up with, this intangible thing of your own ethical standards. Just because a company writes down that they're going to have integrity, that's very hard when it's a company doing it, because it doesn't have a sort of historical background on which to call and say what it means by the word integrity. It just puts it in there. It doesn't have that personal background that people do. So how do you think do companies do it the right way by saying they have integrity, or do they need to sort of almost go back a step and start thinking about what it is they actually mean by that and define it?
That's a very good question. So I think that well, one of the pieces of theory that I used in the research that I did referred to the human entity, where the human entity was either could be an individual, a group, an organization, or indeed a society. So I like that kind of expanding concept of what we mean. Slightly different context, but I kind of feel that, you know, we talk a lot about personality, and personality and our what we feel is right and wrong are not the same thing. However, they're both very personal. If we look at an organization, then organizations have a culture which is, to me, akin to their personality. And again, you know, if you look at the work of people like Sengi, learning organizations need individuals who are motivated to learn, who can then work in groups, teams that are motivated to learn, and enough of those, you've got an organization. That you need it to start with individuals. So kind of pulling that together, I think, yes, I think organizations and professional bodies, because I looked at those as well, I think professional bodies actually do it better than organizations. A lot of them define quite clearly the behaviours that they expect of their members. I think they do it better than many organizations. But again, professional bodies have to do it in such a way that members, so I'm a member of the CIPD, personnel and development. There are people who work in personnel and development from public sector, private sector, small organizations, large organizations, voluntary organizations, and we've all got to be able to read that standard and see that it is relevant to ourselves. That's not easy to do, but if we can define what we expect of people within an organization in a way that it can be made sense of by everybody, then we get individuals behaving in an appropriate way, which becomes collective behavior, which builds up a culture within the organization of behaving in the way that we want. And I suspect that there is a history, there is, you know, however long a company has been around for, you do have that collective, collaborative working together, and you can draw on that for kind of historical acceptable behaviours, I would suggest. That's probably a very rambling answer, but I hope that addresses your question.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, when I was playing in big business, we talked about cultures the way we do things around here, and obviously, you know, somewhere along the line, we define our values, we have a mission statement, we have all of these things, and we write these words in. But I do wonder whether we, as you say, ever truly actually thought about what they meant, or whether you just sort of almost take them at face value, that we all know what integrity means, and therefore we'll put it in because we want to be seen to be acting with integrity. But I'm not sure we ever really drill down into it in the way that you described, which is actually quite interesting.
I think a lot of organizations don't. And actually, I'm doing some work with an employee-owned organization at the moment, and for them, culture is absolutely crucial. And it's the first company I've worked with, and I've worked with a lot, you know, it was worked in consultancy before I moved into academics. I've worked with a lot of organizations over time, and this particular company, this particular organization talks about culture and values more than any organization I've ever worked with before. I think it's really important, because if you put together, you know, a lot of organizations have competency frameworks, have performance management frameworks, make judgments about whether people are behaving in a way that you want them to, probationary periods and performance reviews. But if you've never really talked about what does integrity mean to us, then you've got you can't measure it in the way that you can profit, but you can build frameworks that help you to assess whether it's there or not. But it's difficult to do, and I think a lot of organizations avoid the difficult and go for the easy wins and the easy measures.
Other questions? Sheila.
Oh, I think there were other hands up first, but if I can, then very briefly then. That was fascinating, Karen. I think we could talk a lot about this, and I'd love to have you back again, actually, probably, and take this further. There's lots of questions, but I think there's three that I've got. One, I really was interested in the values continuum that you showed, because actually I think it's really interesting that very often companies will look at the accountability and other things, which actually very clearly on that continuum actually showed on the right-hand side, rather than the left-hand side. So that just got me thinking about actually what are the implications of that in terms of actually where companies are actually focusing on in terms of that continuum, and even the sharing of that more widely would be possibly quite interesting. So it was a continuum. It got me really thinking about today's world of hybrid and artificial intelligence, and where all of this goes to, having, you know, spent Sunday talking to a youngster who's working in a company, fairly new in their career, doing very well, has never had an in-person conversation yet with anybody. Totally remote working. And what are the implications of that in terms of values and integrity? I think are just fascinating going forward. And then the third one, very briefly, it was just your link to cultural intelligence. And I think there's a really interesting one there in terms of values and cultural intelligence. And there's so much work being done by some in terms of cultural intelligence these days that there's a really interesting link that could be made there and developed further, I think.
Thanks for that. Let's take other comments. Patrick, I see your hand is up, and then let Karen come back at the end. Patrick.
Yes, thank you. That was fascinating. Thanks so much, Karen. I agree that when I talk about integrity, I mean the values on the left-hand side of that continuum. which Sheila referred to. And I think that comes through in the Oxford Dictionary definition of integrity, which is that there's a strong moral component too, strong moral principle component. But then I agree with you that you need to be able to articulate that and, in my experience, give examples of that. So almost like a mini case studies. What does that mean in real life? So that's one point. I strongly agree with what you said there, but maybe taking it a stage further in terms of the articulation. The second point is, and this sort of builds on the moral element, and it's based on my experience. I worked for a company where it was very important to do what was legally right. So if, for example, you were invoiced incorrectly by a supplier, then if it was in your favor, you didn't say anything about it. And if by the end of the financial year, nothing had been said, you wrote it back to profit. And the argument was, well, it's not up to us to make sure that the supplier's accounting systems are correct. I then went to work for another company, and for them, it wasn't what was legally right that was important, or that was important, but in addition, it was what was morally right. So if they got an incorrect invoice from the supplier, the very first thing they would do is to phone up the supplier and say, you got it wrong, even though the error was in their favor. And I think it was very interesting to compare and contrast. And what was morally right came from the people at the top of the organization. And they gave the people underneath them the license to do things that were morally right. And it was fascinating to see how people responded to that, because people inherently felt more comfortable doing what was legally right and morally right. So that for me was a really good real life example that I experienced early in my career.
Thank you very much for that. Any other comments before Karen comes back? Claire.
Hi. Yeah, thanks, Karen. That was really, really interesting. And I'm sure we could all talk all night, but I did just want to give you some reassurance. I primarily work in the banking sector, and Lord knows integrity is obviously much needed there. But post the banking crisis, actually, I have sat around a few board tables where integrity really has been discussed. And actually, what a number of them do, and I know a number of other companies that also take this approach, is not try to define integrity too much as part of the values, but to have a code of conduct, which is exactly as you've outlined, which is specific examples of behaviours that they expect to see day to day. And so certainly I would say, in terms of culture and conduct on the banking agendas, even when board papers are presented, people are encouraged to very clearly state what values they support. So I think that those conversations are happening. Just quickly, in terms of the definition, I did wonder if you start looking at the root of the word, that whole, Latin, sort of root, you get that sense of integral behaviour, something that creates that whole. So it will be lots of different parts that collectively add up to what you stand for. But I think, as somebody said in the chat, the real difficulty is that people will have different views about what's right. So even if you feel you're acting with integrity, there probably will be somebody who disagrees. But I jotted down loads of things. It was really interesting. So thank you very much for sharing.
Karen, would you like to come back on those comments?
Yes, thank you. So yes, and I've had a look in the chat, and there's some really interesting comments there. Yeah, going back to the Latin root, and I have to say Latin was never my favourite subject at school. However, going back to the Latin root, yeah, it is integral. It is very definitely a collection of things. And yeah, people do have very different or can have very different ideas about what's right and wrong. What was quite interesting in the research was that there was at least one person who talked about the influence of family, religion, and or culture can be so strong that, you know, one person talked about reflecting in their 20s about why they felt uncomfortable in the way that they behaved all the time. And they did a lot of work to try and understand that, and determined that actually they were living to the values that they had kind of inherited from their parents. And this also happens in a strong culture and sometimes with religion, that people behave with complete consistency in a way that they have become used to or have grown up with. But when you either yourself, you know, integrity is very internal. And if you find that you behave with that, if you're behaving against your belief of what's right or wrong, it's a very internal feeling. And this person identified that they were living to their parents' values, and they did a lot of work to then work out what their own were, and said they felt much more aligned and comfortable when they were living to their own values. And as I say, people also made very similar comments in the context of religion and culture. So I think that's quite interesting as well, that we assume self-awareness, we assume that people know what they believe is right and wrong, but what you think you know and what's core belief or core value is not necessarily the same. So that just gives us another dimension of challenge. Yeah, I completely agree that I mean, that code of conduct is the way of doing things. I was a bit disappointed in the latest version of the CIPD professional standards, that there used to be not only a definition of the kind of professional code of conduct and behaviours, but there was also a statement of the contraindicators. Now, I found those really, really useful, because you can say this is the code of conduct, but the contraindicators give some boundaries to that and say this is what is not acceptable. And I found that immensely powerful. And the comment about examples, again, I completely agree with that. Words can be very dry. If we give examples, so one example that somebody gave me was they worked in an organization which was trying to, where tax, they were chasing people for wrong payments of tax. I can't remember the exact nature of the business, but the way that they had to chase people for money made this particular person very uncomfortable. And but the organization was very profit driven, and people develop strategies in organizations for overcoming that non-alignment or that misalignment between their own values and what they're being asked to do in their job. The way that this person did it was to say, I feel really uncomfortable with asking people to do that, so I'm going to escalate it up, and my boss can do that. I'll do what I'm comfortable with, and somebody else can do the other bit. Other people can't live with that either and say, I don't like the values of this organization, I'm going to leave. So I guess that's where our kind of values priorities become important. Is the job and most aspects of the job fulfilling all our needs? Can we develop a strategy for the bit that we don't like or that we feel is wrong? Or do we walk away from it completely? So people respond and react in different circumstances, but a lot of what I learned from people was through the stories that they told me. So absolutely, dialogue, storytelling and example are really powerful. They take time. We've got to leave time to listen to people. I'll stop now.
Well, We have gone over time, but I'm pleased we haven't. Thank you, everybody, for sticking with it. And thank you, everybody, for adding to it. And I suspect, Karen, that the conversations you have started tonight will continue on into other livery occasions. I can tell you that there are some very close links between what you've been sharing tonight and what we've been finding in the research project. I won't start to share what they are tonight, otherwise we'll be here for a lot longer. But maybe there will be an occasion when you can join us again, and you can help us reflect, which I think you're very good at. And can we give you a huge, and I'll say deep, round of applause, because you have given us a lot of depth to think about tonight, and we're very grateful to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for listening. And if I've helped to start a new conversation, the evening's been a success.
It has indeed.
Thank you.